In this video, I'm going to talk to you about how you interpret box plots. So here we have an example of a box plot. Right, let me just remind you of how box plots are broken up. Recall that the first piece, the whisker on the left side, is the first quarter. Then we have the second quarter, which goes from 4 to 11. The third quarter goes from 11 to 14. And the fourth quarter goes from 14 to 15. So this box plot breaks up the data into 4 quarters. Now, let me remind you of how a box plot is related to the 5-number summary that we've already learned. The lowest point, or the farthest point on your left, is called the minimum, right? So that's the lowest number in your data set. The left edge of the box is the first quartile, Q1. The line in the middle of the box plot is the median, which is also the second quartile. The third, or the right edge of your box, is the third quartile, or Q3. And then at the edge of your whisker on the right-hand side, you have your maximum. So minimum, Q1, median, Q3, and maximum. That's your 5-number summary. These numbers will come back in handy in just a moment, so keep those in mind. Now let's get into some questions. It says, consider this box plot, and it wants to know which quarter has the smallest spread of data. Right, so you'll want to be careful and pay attention to the directions if it says look, or which quarter or which interval. So if it's talking about a quarter, it's got to be one of these things. It's got to be 1 to 4, 4 to 11, 11 to 14, or 14 to 15. Those are our 4 quarters. All right, so if you look at our 4 quarters that are displayed on this box plot, it's easy to see that the smallest spread of data is 14 to 15. So that quarter has the smallest spread. Right, and again, if you examine your box plot, you can easily determine which quarter has the largest spread. You can see that 4 to 11 are spread out the most, so that's your largest spread. So that quarter has the largest spread. Next, they ask us to find the interquartile range. If you recall, the interquartile range is abbreviated IQR, and it's Q3 minus Q1. Right, so a couple of slides back, I helped you identify what Q1 was and what Q3 was. Right, so the first quartile is 4, the third quartile is 14. So plug those numbers in. The IQR is 14 minus 4, which is 10. So that's the interquartile range. I told you earlier that it would be important to pay attention to the words that they use in these questions. It says, are there more data in the interval 5 to 11 or in the interval 11 to 15? Right, so we're no longer talking about quarters. Right, so they're just going to pick some intervals and they want us to look at those. Right, and it says, are there more data within the interval 5 to 11 or in the interval 11 to 15? Now, make sure that you understand what this question is asking. It's not asking which interval is more spread out. If it was asking that, we would say, well, obviously 5 to 11 is probably more spread out. They're asking which interval contains more data. All right, and so to figure that out, we're going to use what we know about box plots. All right, so let's start by looking at the interval 4 to 11. Now, we don't know anything specifically about the interval 5 to 11, but we do know that the interval 4 to 11 contains exactly 25% of the data. We know that because 4 is the first quartile and 11 is the median. So exactly 25% of the data must lie between those 2 points. Now, since the interval 5 to 11 is contained within those 2 numbers, that tells us that the interval 5 to 11 contains less than 25% of the data. Right, so far we know that the interval 5 to 11 contains less than 25% of the data. Now let's consider the interval 11 to 15. The interval 11 to 15 contains exactly 50% of the data. And we know that because 11 is the median and 15 is the maximum. So that tells us that exactly 50% of the data is contained within those 2 points. So we know by looking at these 2 intervals, by what we know about box plots, that there are more data in the interval 11 to 15 because that interval contains exactly 50% of the data. And the interval 5 to 11 must contain less than 25% of the data, since we know that the interval 4 to 11 contains exactly 25% of the data. Right, so there's definitely more data contained in the interval 11 to 15. And then our last question, it says, which interval has the smallest spread of data, and how do you know this? Right, so this may seem similar to a question that they asked you at the beginning, which was what quarter, or which quarter has the smallest spread. Right, so now they're no longer limiting themselves to quarters, they're just referring to intervals. Right, so it gives you some options here. So it talks about the intervals 1 to 4, 4 to 6, 11 to 14, and 14 to 15. So let's consider each one of those intervals. Right, we'll start with the interval 1 to 4. The interval 1 to 4 contains exactly 25% of the data, since this is the minimum to the first quartile. Now the interval 4 to 6, since this interval is contained within the interval 4 to 11, it must contain less than 25% of the data for reasons similar to what we saw in the previous slide. Next, we have the interval 11 to 14. This interval contains exactly 25% of the data because 11 is the median and 14 is the third quartile. And then our last interval, 14 to 15, that contains this exactly 25% of the data because 14 is the third quartile and 15 is the maximum. Right, so each interval contained exactly 25% of the data except for the interval 4 to 6. So that must be the interval that has the smallest spread.